Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Timothy Hugh, okay? All right, good afternoon again, and welcome to this year's CITES 2016. I'm very pleased to see all of you here. As you can see, Professor Daphne Bavelier is right here with us on Skype. Thanks to Simon, who was able to set up Skype by deleting away the advertisement on it. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to briefly introduce Professor Daphne Bavelier to you, after which we will put her off for a while on the screen and we will replay a pre-recorded video that Professor Bavelier had done. Alright? So, especially for you guys, for everyone in this room. About 45 minutes when the pre-recorded video was done, we will have a Q&A about 15 minutes. And then she will be back with us on Skype. And we will take questions and she will try to answer. Okay? So, Professor Bavelier will talk about video games. Now, how many of you like to play video games? Not many. I don't. To some of us, the notion of video games has a bad connotation. I have a teenage boy, about 15 years old, and I could not get him off video games. He's always playing shooting games. So I'm worried that he's addicted to games and not spending time on his lesson. I am sure that I'm not the only parent, because I've come across other parents who are also worried about the influence of video games. But are video games always that negative? Now, Professor Bavelier will actually give a good talk this afternoon to us that tells us about the effects of video games. I'm currently holding a paper that she published in 2013. By the way, she publishes many papers in top journals. That video games can help students with learning disabilities such as dyslexia. Okay, so this is an interesting topic. Can video games actually help students learn? Let me just briefly introduce Professor Bavelier. She is currently a professor at the Department of Psychology at the University of Geneva in Switzerland. She studies how our brain, adapts to changes in experience, either by nature or by training, or by playing video games. Her work shows that playing fast action-packed entertainment video games might help students learn. That is something very interesting. Professor Bavelier initially was trained in biology in France, before moving on to MIT to do a PhD in brain and cognitive sciences. She then went to the Salk Institute at San Diego and trained in human brain plasticity. She joined the faculty of Georgetown University in the USA in the neurology department before moving on to the University of Rochester, also in the USA, in the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences. Then in 2011, she was named professor in the Faculty of Psychology at the current university that she is currently working with, which is the University of Geneva in Switzerland. Over the years, Professor Bavelier had written more than 100 scientific papers, including many papers in top journals such as Nature, Current Biology. She has won numerous awards, and I'm just going to read a few awards here because the list is so long. So one of them is the John Murch Scholar Awards, a 21st Century Award Research Grant, and has been selected as a finalist in the Blair Vernick Awards for Young Scientists. For several years, she has also headed a multi-million-dollar multidisciplinary research initiative sponsored by the Office of Naval Research on complex learning and skill transfer with video games. Okay? Without further ado, I would like to now play to you Professor Bavelier pre-recorded video lecture. Thank you.
So I can just say thank you very much before you cut me off. Thanks so much for your very kind introduction, and I'm sorry I cannot be physically with you today, but I'm really glad and thankful to the organizer that I could share my work with you in this way, and be back for question and answer so that we can discuss more how this work may or may not be relevant to the classroom and education in general. Thank you very much.
Most of us here today are interested in learning. Now, as a brain scientist, I'm specifically interested in how we can enhance brain plasticity and thus facilitate learning. This is in this context that I'm going to tell you about video games. In fact, I'm not going to tell you about any and all video games. I'm going to tell you about a very specific subgenre that we call action video games, which really is mostly first and third person shooter games. Here's an example. As you can see here, the name of the game is not really to enhance your cognitive skills, but rather to go after the bad guy, the zombie, the villain, and get to them before they get to you. Now, although we don't conceive of this activity as a mind-enhancing activity, over the past 15 years, our lab and that of others have actually shown that these games can have positive effect. What I'd like to do today is to illustrate some of these effects and first take an example from vision to show you how we proceed when we do this work in the lab. So we've been looking at how playing action video game enhances how well you see. This is really what you typically correct with your glasses. One example of a visual function we have looked at is what we call contrast sensitivity, or our ability to distinguish different shades of gray. Imagine you're driving on a foggy road and you see some kind of denser gray just in front of you. You're going to have to decide whether you think it's actually a dog crossing or it's just your visual system somehow hallucinating this difference in contrast. This is actually determined by your contrast sensitivity. Your ability at making the correct decision is determined by your contrast sensitivity. Now, when we actually want to measure contrast sensitivity in the lab, we don't ask people to drive in the fog, it would be complicated, but rather they come to the lab, they sit in front of a computer screen, and they're presented with a task like this one. They have to fixate, then they're presented with a first array with 4 crosses, a blank, and a second array with 4 crosses. One of these 2 arrays contains a Gabor patch. It can be either the first one or the second one, and the subjects need to tell us whether it's the first one or second one. They have a response button for first one, a response button for second one. Now, in this case, you may have seen, if you have good vision, that the Gabor patch is actually in the first array. Now, the reason I'm showing you this task is that it should be pretty clear. It's a very basic visual task. We're going to make the contrast in that Gabor patch fainter and fainter to measure the contrast sensitivity of the participant. And this requires about 1.5 hours of measurements in order to properly measure contrast sensitivity at different spatial frequency, from very high spatial frequency, very high acuity, to very low spatial frequency. And I'm telling you that because I wanted to make very clear that this has a very different feel from playing an action video game. And partly this is because our work is really about what can be learned when you play an action video game that could transfer to other functions that are not specifically game related. Now, the first step in our studies is always to compare individuals that I'm going to call action video game players, which are people that report playing this type of games 5 hours per week. They have done so for at least 6 months and often many more months. And we contrast that population to individuals that typically don't play much games, but very specifically don't play any fast-paced, action-packed game. Now, I'm going to call these individuals non-gamers, but it's a misnomer. As you probably know, every young people on an American campus actually play games, but they don't play action games. They may play, for example, card games or puzzle games or strategy games. When we compare them on that vision task, what you can see here on the y-axis is contrast sensitivity. Those people that reported playing action video game have actually a higher contrast sensitivity, meaning they can actually distinguish smaller differences in shades of gray. And so we see here that if you're an action video game player, you indeed have a better contrast sensitivity. Now, a key question is whether this can be trained. That is, can I take any of you in this room, force you to play an action video games, and then see that I've indeed improved your contrast sensitivity? And this is important because our goal here is to understand how we can use video games to enhance performance, so as a form of intervention. So once we find differences between action gamers and non-action gamers, we do training study. We take individuals that play a little bit of video games, but not much. We pre-test, for example, their vision here. Then we randomly assign all of these participants in one of two groups. A group which is forced to play action video games, and a group which is forced to play commercially available video games that are also very entertaining, immersive, but are not action-packed video game. And I put here a few examples of title genre. Everybody plays for the same amount of assigned hours. The training study I'm going to tell you about right now was done in the lab. It was 50 hours training study. Now, it's not 50 hours in 2 days. It's actually 50 hours in about 10 to 12 weeks. So it's about 1 hour per day, 5 days a week over a period of 10 to 12 weeks. At the end of those 12 weeks, people stop. We wait a few days and then come back to be post-tested on the same task we pre-tested here. So in this case, it would be the contrast sensitivity. And the prediction is that if it's truly a causal effect of playing action video game, we should expect those individuals that have played an action video games to show more improvement in contrast sensitivity than those that have been forced to play a control game. So this is exactly what we found. This is improvement in contrast sensitivity. Up, positive, is an improvement, and you can see that the action train group improved. The control train group didn't. This is 5 days after the end of training. In this study, we actually did a long-term retention, and we followed up these subjects. They had stopped training after their 50 hours. We make sure they stopped training through phone calls. Then we call them back for testing 5 months after training, and some of the effect was still there. And even for some subjects, we're able to get them 1 to 2 years after the end of training, and some of the effect was still there. So this is important because it shows that not only we can enhance vision through action video game play, but those enhancements are durable, which is a key feature that you actually want if you're interested in educational application or in application to clinical settings such as rehabilitation of patients. We have actually begun to apply this research to improve vision in amblyopic or lazy eye patients. Now, this is a collaboration with Dennis Levy at UC Berkeley and Marty Banks, also at UC Berkeley. What we do and what's critical is that when we actually design games for clinical population, we modify the game to match the need of our population. So here we're looking at individuals that have normal vision in one eye, and because they had blocked vision early on during development, they have one eye where vision is abnormal. It's not abnormal due to the eye structure itself. It's actually abnormal due now to the fact that their visual cortex didn't develop properly because of early visual problems. So the key question is, can we actually retrain the visual cortex to work properly and to properly process visual information? In order to do that, when we design those games, as I told you, we adapt them. So the first adaptation in the case of amblyopic patient is to make sure that each eye receives their own image. After all, we have two eyes that see very differently. So in order to do that, we split the screen in two, and our patients are actually viewing the display through a stereoscope, so that we can separately send one image to the amblyopic eye and another image to the good eye. This allows us, for example, to play tricks such as this one, where we know that the lazy eye has poor contrast vision, poor acuity, and so we can augment the amount of contrast and luminance in the lazy eye and adapt the normal eye to match in really visibility the lazy eye. It also allows us to do other tricks, such as, for example, bringing the attention of the patients to their amblyopic eye. So here you're going to see the patients play the game, and you're going to see in the amblyopic eye a Gabor patch appearing. It's going to appear only in the amblyopic eye, and the game for the patient is actually to shoot that Gabor patch if it has certain feature, and not shoot it if otherwise. And that means it needs to do a high resolution task on that Gabor patch, but if it fails to shoot it or shoots it when it shouldn't have, it's actually going to transform in a bad bot, which is really hard to kill in the game. And so this really increases attention of the patients toward the amblyopic eye. Now, during this kind of manipulation, we and other groups have shown that you can induce durable improvement in visual acuity even in adults amblyop, whereby the amblyopic eye recover about 1 to 2 lines on the eye chart. This was one example from vision, but what is interesting in the case of action video game is that it's not just basic low-level perceptual skills that are modified, but also high-level cognitive skills. And so I'm going now to illustrate work done by colleagues at Toronto on mental rotation. You probably have heard of a task of mental rotation where participants are presented with this kind of weird shape. In psychology, they're called the shepherd shape. And in the task used by my colleagues here from Toronto, participants were presented with this target shape, and then they were given 4 other shapes, and they had to answer which of these 4 shapes was a rotated version of the target shape. So here you can see shape 1, shape 2, shape 3, shape 4. Try to do it. Is it shape 1? Is it shape 2? Is it shape 3? Is it shape 4? I'm going to give you the answer. It's shape 3, but hopefully you can get a feel for the kind of cognitive manipulation that is needed to actually do this task. They used a very similar design to the vision design I presented. They pre-tested their subject on one version of that mental rotation task. They randomly assigned them to one of 2 training groups, one group that was forced to play an action video game, another group that was forced to play a visual motor control game. Everybody played their game. It was a 10-hour training study. Again, it's not 10 hours in a day, it's 10 hours over a period of 2 weeks. And then at the end of the 2 weeks, a few days later, or a few months later, they post-tested on different versions of that mental rotation task. What they observed is that the group that has been trained with the action video game actually improved in mental rotation. That improvement could be seen a few days, but also a few months after the end of training. In contrast, the group that had been trained with a control video game showed no change in performance. Now I've shown you 2 examples, one from vision, one from cognition. And recently we have been performing a meta-analysis reviewing the amount of studies that have been published on action video game. That includes about 8,000 subjects. And we have been showing that there is a sizable effect overall of about half a standard deviation from playing action video game. And the aspects of performance that are most changed are perception, top-down attention or attentional control, spatial cognition, including visual short-term memory, and multitasking task switching, which requires a lot of cognitive flexibility. Other areas that are less changed are response inhibition, bottom-up attention, and, for example, verbal cognition. So I'm not telling you that all aspects of performance change for the better, but there are already sizable changes in some domains of cognition which are not typically thought of as being related to each other. Now, that kind of broad transfer is relatively intriguing because we know that in learning, one of the big challenge is what we call the curse of specificity, or the fact that you can train on a task, become extremely good at that task, but it's going to be very hard to have that knowledge transfer to another task, even a somewhat related task. And here we have relatively broad transfer compared to the rest of the literature on learning. Now, we have asked ourselves what are the mechanisms that can actually allow for that broad transfer. And what I'm going to submit to you is that really what has changed and allows that broad transfer, the first stepping stone is this change in top-down attention or attentional control. I realize this is somewhat counterintuitive because there's almost not a week that goes by without you reading in the media that new technologies, including video games, are turning our children into attentional zombies or ADD, ADHD patients. When it comes to action video games, we actually have done studies measuring the attention of action video game players, and I can tell you they have outstanding attention. Now, one of these tests that we used is a test of variables of attention, which is often used actually with ADD, ADHD children. It's a very simple test. The participants are seated in front of a computer screen, and they are presented with one square at a time. If the square is at the top of the screen, they need to respond. If the square is at the bottom of the screen, they need to withhold their response. So as you can see here, the participant is in a go mode. They go and respond, and then from time to time you need to withhold your response. It's really tagging inhibition. There is a counterpart, which is more about sustained attention, where the task is extremely boring. You have nothing to do because most of the time the square is at the bottom of the screen. And then from time to time you have to respond. It's a little bit what you're experiencing right now, trying to focus on me talking. We know that under sustained attention condition, you get longer reaction time than under this impulsivity condition. And this is what I'm showing you here, reaction time are plotted in the y-axis. And what you can see is that under sustained attention, you have overall longer reaction time. But what's also very striking is those young adults that reported being action video game players, here in blue, are much faster than those that reported not playing such games. And this is true both for sustained and impulsive condition. Now you could very well argue, well, we know these action video game players are really fast. In fact, they tend to be trigger happy, so maybe they are fast at the cost of accuracy. But what is interesting and distinctive is that they don't lose in accuracy. So this is a measure of accuracy, D prime, which shows that people that play action video game go faster, but they don't pay a price in terms of accuracy. So clearly these individuals are not more impulsive or have less sustained attention than people that don't play action video game. And in fact, if you step back and ask yourself, what does that mean to be faster without making more errors? Well, that means you can actually make more correct decisions per unit of time, which may be very useful in the workforce. This is something that was independently actually discovered by a group at Beth Israel that realized that their laparoscopic surgeons, the young laparoscopic surgeons, performed better in terms of surgery simulations than even the most seasoned one when they happened to be video game players. So these young newbies, if they were video game players, had really good surgery times and success. This has led this group to look at training with different kinds of video games, including action video games, and understanding which aspect of laparoscopic surgery benefits from action video game play, and which one you still need to teach in the context of the very specific needs and knowledge that laparoscopic surgery requires. Now, more generally, we have done many studies over the years to show that there is an enhancement of top-down attention, that is this ability that we have to control our attention to focus it on one task and ignore sources of noise or distraction. And I'm not going to go through that research, which is well documented in the literature, but I'd rather like to turn right now to actually the neural basis of that effect. We have been doing a number of fMRI studies looking at which aspects of seem to be modified in action video game player. And this is a case for the parietal lobe, which sustains orienting attention, the frontal lobe, which really is important for maintaining attention, and the anterior cingulate for controlling and regulating flexibly where attention needs to be allocated. This overall frontal parietal network is modified, and it's modified in the sense that it seems to become much more automatic in people that play action video game. Now, I've told you about enhancement in attention control and top-down attention. I think it's important to realize that not all aspects of attention are equally modified. And for example, one aspect of attention, which has to do with this very quick automatic pool of exogenous attention you may have if suddenly, for example, there was a loud alert coming out of this room. This aspect of attention doesn't seem to change in individuals that are action video game players. It has the same speed, that automatic pull takes place, but it's not happening faster. The main change is that these individuals that are action video game players can recover from that automatic pull faster if it happens to not be a useful one. So this is one keystone of what we think leads to these many different aspects of improvement in performance. And this is actually one of the contexts in which I'd like to discuss a change that has been documented after playing action video games that has to do with reading. In our own study, we've been looking at reading and whether action video game play were to modify some aspects of reading. What we found is that people that play action video game make less mistakes when they read non-words, so pronounceable non-words, like for example when you read blickets. They're not faster, they're just more accurate. If they read words, people that are gamer and non-gamers are very fast and very accurate, and you don't find a major difference. Now, building on this work, a group in Italy from Andrea Faccoetti has been showing that action video game play helped reading fluency in Italian children with dyslexia. And the outcome of that study is that children that are Italian speakers and that have been diagnosed with dyslexia are helped by training with action video games. Here we really think the mechanism is again this attention control I documented before, because in Italian, the main issue with reading Italian is really at the attentional level. The language is very transparent, meaning that the mapping between orthography and phonology is very easy. And so the bigger roadblock is in how to parse the word on the page and how to actually move one's eyes and segregate between the different units that need to be read. This is where attention can be really important, and this is why this result seems to be documenting a change in language that is mediated through this change in attentional control. Okay, so just to summarize, I've told you that action, video, and play enhance top-down attentional control. I've shown you data in young adults, but we also know this is the case in children. We've done studies in schools between 7 and 17 years old. We think that these action video game players then are better at selecting relevant information for the task at hand and ignore source of distraction, especially when the task is difficult. And this increase in signal-to-noise ratio leads them to be able to make more accurate decisions or more accurate inference about the state of the world so that they can actually perform better at the task. So the next part of this presentation, what I'd like to go over is how this greater enhancement in attentional control and better ability at filtering source of distraction or interruption leads to actually a better ability to learn. The idea here is that if you have very good attentional control, you can very quickly focus on what is task relevant and ignore all irrelevant information. And this is actually going to give you an edge for learning because you're going to be able to very quickly learn what are the relevant statistics or the relevant information to pay attention to in order to excel at the task that you're doing. And so in this view, we view transfer from action video game not so much as direct transfer, but really as a form of what we call learning to learn, whereby those individuals initially experience the same task difficulty, but because of this attentional enhancement, can zoom down on what's diagnostic for the task and then learn faster. So I'm going to show that to you in the context of a very low-level, basic perceptual learning task. This is a task where participants are seated in front of the computer screen. They're asked to do an orientation discrimination of a Gabor patch that you can see here that is sandwiched between two mask noise. This is very hard. This is very faint. This is a learning task because their orientation discrimination is the following. They are told from an imaginary minus 35-degree reference angle, is this Gabor patch tilted to the left or tilted to the right? It's very hard for non-vision scientists to know that this is a Gabor patch which is tilted to the right, but we teach them by giving them feedback. And then as we teach them, we remove more and more contrast from the display. This is our measure of learning. And so we can actually track their learning over time by the amount of contrast that is needed in the image. What has been known, and the reason why we use this task has been very well described in the perceptual learning literature. And learning is possible, but it's relatively slow. And so what you can see here, this is non-video game players that are learning, doing 4 sessions per day over 2 days. In the case of action video game players, what you can see is that their learning curve is much, much steeper. So they are faster at learning that perceptual learning task. Now we wanted to show this was not just due to a group difference, but that we could induce such learning to learn in anyone through training. So we're expecting participants to initially be equivalent in their learning, and then we force them to play different type of video game, and we show that they have different learning curve, with the key prediction of learning to learn having the two populations initially starting from the same level, and then people that have been assigned to an action video game group learning faster. So it's a very similar design to the one I presented earlier, where what you can see is that we're pre-testing participants on a learning task. We are then forcing them to play 45 hours of either an action or a control game. It's 2 separate groups. Each group played 3 different games, 15 hours each. They did so at home in the study, and we monitored them. And then after they were done with their 45-hour training studies, a few days later, they came back for post-testing, and there we tested their learning. So this is the same task as the one we just saw before, this Gabor orientation task. Again, the least amount of contrast threshold, the better the performance, so learning is going down. And what you can see is that the action trained group learned faster than the control trained group. This, again, is after 45 hours of video game training. Before training, the two groups didn't differ. Now, I showed you an example here from perceptual learning. I'd like to now turn to a very different type of learning, which has to do with cognitive learning. A key question is whether this idea of learning to learn scales up to a higher level of cognition. So here we actually joined force with Susan Yegi at UC Irvine and used a task that she and John Jonitis have been using in the past, the dual and back task. This is not an easy task. It's a task where you listen to a series of letters at the same time as you view a series of squares at different locations. Now, in a typical one-back task, you would, for example, have to listen to the auditory stream and detect when there is a one-back repetition. And if there is a one-back repetition, you respond and you say, yes, this C was preceded by a C one-back. In this dual and back task, you have to do a one-back on the auditory stream, but also one back on the visual stream. And these are not concomitant. So, for example, here you can see that this is a one back where you would respond here, yes, on the visual there is a match, but at that location here for auditory there is no match. Now, once people have correctly learned the one back, we go to two back. What does two back means? Two back means that instead of being a repetition just before, it's a repetition two back. So it would be like two letters before, etc. So we adaptively adjusted this N back level according to the participants' performance in the previous block, and in this way could measure their learning. Again, this is a training study, so these are individuals that were having the same working memory and back performance initially. We force them to play action video games, 45 hours of either action or control. For the control group, here I show you their N back level as they train. This is 3 days of training. And you can see that it goes a little bit up, but not a lot. People that have been forced to play the action video game show a much faster learning of that N back task. So here again is this idea that playing action video game enhances attention control, and through this greater flexibility enhances the possibility of learning very cognitive tasks such as the dual and back task. Now, we have published data showing that people that play action video games are better learners in the domain of perceptual learning and visual motor control. I just showed you data from working memory and the dual and back task. We're working on perceptual decision making, so the ability to make decisions about your surrounding world based on perceptual features of it, but also doing studies about much more cognitive aspects of performance, such as the ability to learn statistical regularities in languages. So some of these data are not out yet, but we're really trying to understand how far we can actually push this learning to learn hypothesis. We certainly don't have any data telling us that it generalized to very high level of cognitive skills, such as problem solving and thinking. Most of the examples that I've shown you here require to manipulate information that is given by the environment, or to filter information from the environment. In the case of problem solving and thinking, the main difference is that now you need to retrieve information from long-term memory store, and the noise or distraction is not coming from environmental factors, but rather knowing which exact memory representation one needs to be retrieved and which one are actually sources of confusion. Now, in closing, I'd just like to discuss a few next steps. First, learning to learn is here presented in a very broad fashion, but if you were to ask me, we don't think these individuals that play action video game will be good at all learning tasks, but rather we think that they are good at learning tasks that have a certain set of features. And so we're trying to understand what kind of prior do they come to in our task that allows them to learn faster. And if we understand that correctly, that means we can design tasks where they're going to fail. And so there's actually one of the research avenue in the lab sorry, is to understand when they're actually going to have failure. We also know that there are clear individual differences in learning. We expect very marked individual differences in learning to learn. They are probably not just under the control of action video game play. There's a very rich literature linking different types of executive function, fluid general intelligence to individual differences in learning. We suspect it's the same with learning to learn, but we don't know. So we're actually doing that kind of work to better understand what are the determinants of learning to learn. We're also really interested in motivation. I showed all these training studies to you where we can actually show effects when we force people to play an action video games that are different from effects when we force people to play other kind of control games. Now, it should be very clear that in these studies, our subjects are heavily monitored and they are all highly motivated. But also raise the question of what's the role of motivation in general. Clearly, here we're comparing two different video games that we know are commercially available video games, very high quality, very immersive, highly motivating. So there is no real difference in motivation between our video games. But we have data showing that there is an interaction between the nature of the video game and the motivation of the subjects. Even with a very immersive action video games, if the subject is absolutely not motivated, you're not going to get the same level of learning. And so there is a very important part of the work that has to be done on understanding how to better motivate participants to learn. Now, in our hands, we know that even if we motivate the control gamers to learn, they still don't show this learning to learn. So it's really an interaction between the nature of the game and the motivation of subjects. For me, we think we can do much better than action video game in the context of learning. And there's certainly very interesting literature, which I'm sure some of you are going to touch on today, that has to do with everything you can do around the game experience that is really more social and has to do with debriefing of participants or even generative conversation that are about scaffolding the knowledge around what happened in the gameplay and really consolidating the knowledge in this way, and also having a way of expressing it in a direct, reflected way rather than just this inner, rather immersive way. And there is a number of research suggesting this actually enhances, indeed, learning. What we're also doing right now in the lab is understanding how these results that we have so far focused on perception, attention, and cognition may generalize to emotional and social domains. And I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have about that. And we're also working on understanding what are the game factors that foster learning. I showed you action video game has an impact on mental rotation, but a visual motor control game doesn't have the same impact. Why? What are the features in action video game that leads to enhanced attention control and better learning to learn? So with these thoughts, I actually want to thank my different lab members and collaborators that were instrumental in generating all this work, and all of you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much for the very wonderful pre-recorded lecture. But before we move on to the Q&A session, is there anything else that Professor you might want to tell us or to add on to the lecture?
No, I'd love to engage and answer any question you may have, and then we can go from there.
Okay, if there's nothing from Professor, can we now open it to the audience? There's Mike, you need to raise your hand for the microphone. So do we have any questions?
Hi, Daphne. I have two questions, in fact. One relates to the improvement in vision, even for adults, after playing the game. Of course, I want to benefit from that. And my question is the improvement in vision because of the neuro acuity? Or because, I mean, when I think about vision, I'm thinking about my degenerating retina. So that's one question. And then the other question I have is, you show us the attentional benefit of playing video games. I'm just wondering whether this is due to the fact that if you're playing the video game, you cannot actually multitask. And we are so used to multitasking. And so I'm just wondering whether you have done any work that associates the sort of video game players or non-players in relation to their multitasking behavior. So thank you.
Sure. Hi, Nancy. Thanks very much for your questions. So concerning vision, we know that the changes are not at the level of the eye. So if you have a degenerating retina, there's not much we can do for you. We know that the changes are at the level of the visual cortex, maybe earlier in the thalamus, we don't know. But these are actually changes that are downstream from the eye, and that's the reason why we're actually looking at amblyopic patients, because amblyopia is basically a miswiring of the visual system because of vision deprivation very early in life. And then you can fix that vision deprivation by doing surgery, realigning the eye, removing the cataract. But the fact that there's been a few months of poor vision sets the visual pathway and its development on the wrong track. And so what we're doing is we are like retraining cortical connection and maybe thalamocortical connections to recover the right configuration. But we certainly don't have any impact on eye factors. It's actually very complementary to what your glasses may be doing or your lenses are doing. About multitasking, so if you analyze gameplay in those games, there's actually a lot of different goals and sub-goals that you need to maintain and flexibly switch from one to the other. They are all in the service of a main goal, which is to win the level of the game. But there are many trade-offs that you need to do, and so you need to switch tasks actually very often. This is why we think when we actually measure the ability of people that play action video game to multitask or task switch, they are actually better than the people that don't play these games. There's something a little contradictory in the literature, which is that the people that do a lot of multitasking and task switching on their multiple devices, so people that engage in media multitasking, have very poor multitasking abilities. And so one of the questions we've been asking ourselves is that in the game, you switch between tasks that are all related to a rather clear goal of achieving your aim on that one level. In everyday life, you switch between many different tasks that are probably related to your overall life quality, but maybe very disconnected when you're answering a friend on Facebook and then sending an image on Snapchat and then reading a Wikipedia page. It may be for three totally different type of worry. One is social. The other one is getting information on Wikipedia. The third one may actually to play a prank on your friend. So it seems that there is more than meets the eye. It's not just because software asks you to multitask that you're going to be better at multitasking. It's the context in which it's done also.
Daphne, I have a question myself. This is regarding to the last point that you make on your slide. I'm very interested to find out whether you have done any research upon the effects of playing action video games on the students' interaction with their peers, the social. Because there are some people who are afraid that when you lock yourself in the room and play the whole day action video games, you are getting antisocial. Now, have you done any research that's actually examined the impact of playing such video games on the social life, on the interaction with other people?
So in Geneva, there's actually a center for affective and emotional sciences. So we have begun to do work around emotion, much more than around social interaction. But as you probably know, there is also a large literature on video game and violence, right? These video games, action video games, some of them have violence, like the first-person and third-person shooter games that we use for our training study are actually violent games. There is one thing that we have, we and other labs have replicated. If you play about half an hour or even like 15 minutes of a violent media, or you watch a violent movie, the next few minutes afterwards, you're going to be tendency to be more aggressive toward others. And for example, we measure that with a task where we look at the amount of pain you're willing to actually receive, but also give a competitor. And this is a phenomenon which is very well described and has been repeated and replicated in many different labs. What's interesting is that this effect dissipates, that is, it doesn't last. And so what we're interested in is the difference between long-lasting effects that take a long time to induce, like the kind of changes that I've shown you in this talk. And then what we are discovering now are much more fleeting effect on your mood, on your aggression, on your empathy. So we can change that by the context of the game to give people a video game that is promoting help of others. People will be more empathic, but again, they will only be more empathic for a few minutes, 10 to 15 minutes after the game. So it's a very different type of dynamic. We think it's a different type of brain plasticity. It doesn't have the same features, and so we're just beginning to look at that. Now, there's two more other points I'd like to make. First, there is data in the literature showing that if you binge, like if you do a 10-hour training study, but rather than doing it in 2 weeks, you do it in 2 days, you don't get the same effect. You actually get less of an effect. So it's really important that this is small distributed practice. And so our work is certainly not enthused for binging. If your children say, oh, Dr. Bavelier showed this is good for my brain, you can say, yeah, well, probably, 25 minutes to 40 minutes 5 times a week. And that will cut down a lot on the excess of your 15-year-olds. The other thing, too, is that we often conceive as adults as those games being very isolating. But if you look at what is really making the success of today's video games, is all the social interaction around the game. It's very rich. If you, like most kids, like most games right now are being played with a Skype session or a blog, and you have team collaboration, team competition, you have a lot of strategizing between humans in order to get to your goal. And so the view of the lone player is a rather mistaken view compared to the amount of social interaction that it actually requires to play the games of the 21st century.
Yes, we have a gentleman there.
Hi, my name is Mark. I just have a quick question. Do you have any data on gender performance? Was your subject pool made up of male and females? And
Yeah, so it's a very good question. When we compare action video game players to non-action video game player, we do that only in males because we don't have enough females that really like this kind of games. It's changing. So you have to realize that the game ecosystem has changed enormously between when we started the studies in 2000 and now 16 years later. But it's still the case that those type of games mostly attract males. When we do training study, we actually train an equal amount of male and female. Early on, actually, our colleagues in Toronto reported that females benefited more from training than males, but then they showed that it was due to a difference at baseline. That is, that the female tended to do less well on the tasks that were being measured, and as a result, they improved more because they started from a lower performance. If you equate performance between male and female, everybody benefits the same, and that's what we also found in all of our studies. Now, I should add that the female are really unhappy to be assigned to the action group. They sigh, they complain, they give it all their eyes. They don't want to play those games, but they benefit as much.
Do we have any last question? Yes.
Hello, Professor. I'm Crystal, and your talk is really interesting and actually very fun. I found out that actually I'm also a patient of amblyopia, and it turns out that your result shows that it also works for adult, and I wonder where we can find it and to look at how we can get access to this kind of game. Yeah. And another thing is, in your last slide, you also mentioned that the social game and emotional game, how they can also have benefits for us. And because as you mentioned, that action game seems to have more benefits cognitively. Yeah. So I was wondering what because. And I can see in the action game we often have a very clear goal. I just wondering in the social game what because according to my experience, we just feel fun and just playing it, but not necessarily have a very clear goal or yeah. So I was wondering how you look at this the future of this kind of social game study.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. So about amblyopia, there is no commercially available software which is available. It's all research. But if you send me your, I would need it to be translated in English because my Chinese is not exactly up to speed. But if you send me your a summary of your eye examination, I can get it reviewed by one of our MD, and we can already tell you what you can do and try in the comfort of your own. I don't want to tell you that you can do it now because we don't want to induce conditions like diplopia where you would see double. So there's a number of things that needs to be checked. But you can certainly contact me and I'll be happy to provide you recommendations. About the future video game for social interaction. So the games that have been most studied right now are the games that have actually a very clear goal. So not the kind of social games that you're thinking of. They are games where the goal of the player is to actually help a number of the other characters and to provide support so that they can actually escape the bad guys or find the treasure. So you're putting the participants, the gamer, either in a position of helping others or competing with others. And that's where you see these differences where if you ask people to help others in the game, and then you give them a social psych task where, for example, by mistake, the experimenter drops a big can of pen on the floor and you look at how likely people are then willing to help them to naturally get up and help them pick it up. If you've been playing a helping game, you're more likely to help the experimenter than if you've been playing a competitive game. So this is most of the research. There's a lot of research on the quality of the social interaction in social games, quality or lack of quality, like, right, it goes both ways. What the research is pointing to is that the social interactions are actually extremely complex, and they are probably as complex as what is happening in everyday life. But that hasn't been studied in what it means and what its impact on the rest of your social life.
Okay, thank you so much for all your questions. Let's put our hands together. Thank you, Professor Bavelier.
Thank you so much to all of you. And again, I'm really sorry I can't be among you, but I'm so thankful to have had the opportunity to present my work here and share that with you. Thank you very much.